Bonjour, good afternoon. Apologies for the little delay in getting started, but this is the trauma-informed education session, supporting learners through relationship-based education. We have Denise Baxter and Christy Radbourne from Lakehead University here to present. Denise Baxter has been honing her knowledge of education from K to post-secondary for over 25 years. She's a member of Martin Falls First Nation and is committed to building healthy educational systems for all learners. And Christy Radbourne is a principal in Lakehead Public Schools. She is a PhD candidate and the Lakehead Ontario Principals Council President. So miigwech to Denise and Christy, and take it away.
Thank you very much. Bonjour, Denise Baxter, Indigenous, Makwadoda, Martin Falls, and Donjiba. I would like to thank you for having us today, and happy that we could join the educators across the north. I would like to recognize at this moment that I am situated in, not in my NAN territory, but on the traditional territory of Anemkiwaju, or Fort William First Nation, in the Robinson Spirit Treaty of 1850. I would also just like to take a moment to recognize the shocking news, I guess, that has, was unleashed to the world on Friday. I know it was, and I've heard different people speaking, but also recognizing that this is not, was not unexpected. And I know, unfortunately, that we'll be probably expecting more over the next, as different communities work within their own communities. But it is a difficult time, and we just want to take a moment to recognize that those children that did not make it home. And of course, many of those, like my father and grandparents and aunts and uncles, did make it home, but also to recognize the resiliency of those survivors. So miigwech.
Miigwech, Denise. If you want to start our screen share.
Oh, I can absolutely do that.
And while Denise is loading, and here we are, I think in light of what's just happened, there's a good conversation again coming to light about trauma in terms of schooling and education and in the students that we see today. And so today's workshop, we're going to talk about some of our learning and some of the things and experiences we've had in enacting trauma-informed education and supporting learners through relationship-based education.
Thank you. Oh, yeah.
So we're going to frame our talk today in really four areas: creating and maintaining a shared responsibility for all our children, building community and positioning schools as community hubs, and building resilience and sustainability.
Thank you, Christy. One of the ways that we do that is utilizing strengths. And both Christy and I have worked within schools that really do strengths work. And part of that work is based on the research of Dr. Edward Wana and Dr. Keith Brownlee, both professors at Lakehead University, and some early work in supporting Indigenous students in particular, but also all students in utilizing strengths. And we have seen this, from our youngest children who come in at 3-4 years old. And I'm doing the same work right now with university students. So we know this is a really good practice at utilizing the strengths of ourselves, understanding ourselves. One of the key pieces that we know really connects to identity, but also connects to what a strength is these 4 statements we have. I can, meaning I'm competent. I trust, and meaning that work that you do with each other, you're trusted and you're trustworthy. I hope, that's some pieces around the importance of being hopeful, and I'm valued. And so recognizing that these 4 areas, that sense of belonging, that sense of competency, that sense of hopefulness, all of those are really, really key protective factors, particularly for children and youth, as we think about how to support students who are facing trauma. And then most recently, the latest version of from a provincial framework, we have the promoting well-being, the 4th pillar. So the province of Ontario has recognized for at least the last 7 years the importance of well-being as part of the curriculum. And that was a big move. I think, as Anishinaabe people, we always knew that within those teachings of the medicine wheel that our mental health was important. But we now have, thankfully, other scholars, I guess, out there recognizing that this well-being is important. And then another piece that we talk about, and I have, I've worked in Constance Lake First Nation for 5 years early in my career, and then at the Matawa Learning Center. But working across with principals from schools within the North, the important place that schools have as community hubs. They become, the social space for schools. We might be playing volleyball, we might be playing sports. It might be a place to come together in the evening. Certainly, when the community comes together for important things, it's often the school gymnasium where that happens. And so really recognizing that community hub space of where we might have professionals who might be visiting the community to provide supports for students and families as well. Those become really important pieces. I think another piece that both Christy and I have is the importance of healthy nutrition. And so our schools become those hubs with our community kitchens, with our way of having community feasts with our community wider out. So all of these pieces really are focused on the positives and the strengths area versus thinking about things from a deficit space.
So just to set the context a bit, Denise has really given you the framework that we work from, which is strengths. But in setting the context, we're going to look at defining trauma and its impacts, and then why is it important in schools, and how do we support it in our schools? And I think coming at this from a couple assumptions, one of them is that we really have a privilege and a responsibility to promote mental health and well-being and wellness at our schools. Kids are in school a significant portion of their day and a significant portion of their lives. And this is a great opportunity to ensure that we are supporting parental and community supports in terms of mental health and well-being. We also know that good mental health and well-being are really key to learning. And if we're not promoting that, then we're really struggling with the learning agenda as well. Additionally, it needs to be done in a meaningful and manageable way. We need to have some clear objectives, and teachers really need an ability to focus on some specific practices that will promote both mental health and well-being in our schools. So this is the context which we're going to come from.
When we think about promoting a whole school focus, just to pick up on some of those threads that Christy just spoke of, one of the key pieces around there's several areas that we need to be thinking about, and self-care is one of them. Certainly from a child's perspective, self-care, spending those times and those early years to help children learn ways that they can engage in self-care. For your staff at the school, having those moments, because often it's the school staff sometimes will just go to the wall and then they run out of everything that they need to keep going, and then they're not actually helpful to themselves or to their students that they're hoping to serve. I know both Christy and I have also spent energy and time working with community and family to promote self-care. And what does that look like from a family space as well? And working with professionals from the community, but also pulling upon the strengths of elders and community members to speak with us and actually engage in practicing self-care. Building relationships is a really key piece, because if you think about that fabric of your community, relationships are really at the heart of it. And those relationships support each other. And, if you need a little bit of extra lift, someone is right there with you to help give you that lift till you're ready to go again. And then at other times you may give that lift to other people. Another key piece is professional development in terms of, as we're doing today, I guess really thinking about what is trauma, what are the impacts, how do we mitigate these things? But that professional learning is continual and ongoing. And it's really important, and we'll share a couple of examples with you of how this is embedded into practice every day in classrooms, across schools. And then certainly sharing those strengths outwardly and those practices outwardly is another area of promotion.
Thank you, Denise. So the next piece, and this is when we start to talk about some of the really explicit teaching and some of the explicit practices we want to engage both staff and ultimately students in as well. And that's really looking at the brain research, because Trauma affects the brain in very real ways, and it actually can make it difficult, if not impossible, for children to, quote, behave or to act in certain ways. And this includes things like decision making, forming meaningful and trusting relationships, and attachments. And so all of those things affect children's behavior, and they also then affect the way in which they interact in the school community. And it also then affects their ability to actually learn. So it's not about, one of the things we really want teachers to understand when we do this, PD, is it's not about an unwillingness. Children don't show up to behave in a certain way. Pardon me. Children don't choose to behave this way or choose to, quote, misbehave. For children who have experienced trauma, this is a very real inability to control different types. Oh, excuse me. Sorry, I have lots of people running through my school. This is a real inability for children to be able to control these impulses, to be able to form lasting and meaningful relationships, and to be able to make responsible decisions. Once we understood, and we worked with our teachers in my particular experience to learn how the prefrontal cortex controls things like decision-making and impulses, and how the hippocampus and amygdala work together to control your ability to control either outburst or your feelings or relationships. And we talked in those explicit languages. Teachers then had they had both the understanding to create those empathic relationships and to use their practice to address this explicitly. We went a step further, though, in our work at the schools that I've been at, and that was we taught the children as well the same language about prefrontal cortex, about hippocampus and amygdala, and that was really important because they could then identify what was acting up, what wasn't working for them, and when you give children that kind of agency, they're then able to overcome some of those things, those inabilities.
Christy, this was your slide still.
My apologies. So these are some of the risk factors in terms of children who come to us with trauma, and some of the individual pieces regarding their parents' lack of understanding of children's needs, child development, and parenting skills. And one of the real key points of that is, as I just talked about, teachers also didn't come to us with the knowledge, and they don't teach us in Teachers College about those brain pieces and about how those are affected by trauma. Parents don't have that knowledge either. It's not a matter of lay knowledge. The history of child maltreatment in the family of origin, that's a definite risk factor. Substance abuse and our mental health issues, including depression, parental characteristics, non-biological transient caregivers in the home, and parental thoughts and emotions, all that support or justify maltreatment behavior, are all risk factors for children experiencing trauma. Then there are family risk factors, and I think this one today we can speak to really with some experience at this time, and that's social isolation, as across our communities we're experiencing this because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we can see firsthand for that we couldn't see before, that we weren't willing to see now, we can see across demographics that what social isolation does in terms of trauma. Family disorganization, dissolution, and violence. These are also family risk factors, and parenting stress and poor child relationships. And then anytime you add these two together, so you have more than one, anytime that happens, then you unfortunately, it increases exponentially the traumatic impact on children's brains and their ability to sustain mental health and well-being within the school setting. There are also community risk factors. The community violence is one, and then concentrated neighborhood disadvantage. And we see this quite often in our urban communities when we have high poverty rates, residential instability, unemployment rates, and high density of alcohol outlets, and the poor social connections that happen in communities that are at risk. So individually, they by themselves certainly create trauma, but when compounded together, it increases that trauma effect exponentially.
So these are just some examples of some common problems that you might see associated with trauma. One being a persistent fear response. You may see hyperarousal or hypoarousal. disassociation from events, disassociation from actions and maybe consequences. You may also see those increased internalizing symptoms. And, right now, I think, unfortunately, over the last probably 5 to 7 years, the anxiety that children and youth have has just risen exponentially. And so these various traumas that people have experienced are really manifesting in ways that are really difficult for young people. And I mean, fortunately, there's a lot of support out there. Most of it's in the form of 1-800 numbers. But if you're fortunate enough, you may have people in your own community that can help with, that counseling aspect around anxiety and depression. Certainly thinking about diminished executive functioning. This is really evident, I would say, in how well kids are managing at school through their cognitive flexibility, their working memory, their inhibitory control. Are they, managing assignments on time? Are they showing up for class? Are they finding a way that they can put to memory work that they're learning at school? All of those pieces really are impacting learning in a quite a profound way, because we know executive functioning is a key player, not just in learning but also in the workplace. If we think about delayed milestones developmentally, you may see that more often in your younger children, where you have delayed reading. It might be grade 4 or 5 before kids are reading. It might be language developmental milestones. It might be toileting. If you have younger children coming to school, you may be involved in toilet training up to the age of 6 or 7 in some cases. A weakened response to positive feedback and that lethargy, where kids just aren't engaging or they're not attaching in a way with you and when within others within your classroom. And then those social interactions become complicated because people don't have maybe the pathways to recognize what something is, and they may view it as something other than it is based on their own experiences to this point.
Okay, thank you, Denise. And this, you can certainly read this statement for yourself, but a trauma-sensitive school is really one in which we feel safe, welcomed, and supported. And we're addressing explicitly trauma's impact on learning in a school-wide basis. And this includes several factors. Most importantly, leadership and staff need to share an understanding of trauma's impact on learning and the need for a school-wide approach. And some of that I talked about just earlier about some of the work we did with staff and then translated into work with students. They need the explicit PD on understanding what trauma is, its impact, and what it does in terms of students accessing learning. That the school supports all students to feel safe both physically, socially, emotionally, and academically. And those are all very separate pieces of a child's development within a school. The school also needs to address students' needs in holistic ways. We have to take into account their relationships, the self-regulation, academic competence, physical and emotional well-being, the spiritual child, all parts of the child. We have to come at this work from that holistic space. The school needs to explicitly connect students to the school community and provide multiple opportunities for practicing these newly developing skills. And as we talked about, as much as we're training and teaching our staff to recognize trauma, the impacts of it, we're also teaching children to understand and recognize the impacts, because that agency is what gives children that efficacy to help address their own and really engages them in the work themselves and help them access the learning. The school needs to embrace teamwork and share the responsibility for all students. I know at my school that we did a great deal of this initial work at, we always had a saying that we own all of the children there. They're all our children, not just the grade 1 teacher or the grade 2 teacher or the JKSK teacher, but all of us have a responsibility to all of the children in the school. Leadership and staff need to anticipate and adapt to the ever-changing needs of students. And if anything, the most recent work in COVID-19 has taught us is that things do change, both community-wide, school-wide, and on an individual basis. And we need to understand and be ready for what worked yesterday doesn't always work today. And we need to be able to support it in the same way in which we started the school year. Denise?
Thank you. So, and another key piece is a focus on relationships. And so we have a quote here: no significant learning can occur without a significant relationship. And certainly in the 25 plus years I've been working in education, we've often talked about those important relationships that children and youth have with those caring adults, but also with each other. So how do you think about building those relationships becomes a really important piece to supporting learning. So when we think of outside the home, school is the next most important and influential environment for children. We know they spend 5 to 6 hours a day typically when we're face to face at school. And if they're involved in after school activities or before school activities, it could be longer in their day. It's really important for children and youth to make sure that they have that safety, security, and consistent relationships. We know that those are a fundamental human need. We also know that acceptance and belonging are basic human drivers for how we interact with the world. So these relationships are both a means to achieve other goals as well as an end unto themselves. As we think about the development of us as human beings, we know that as we learn and develop through relationships, that's how we build those relationships with others. We also know that effective teaching requires a presence of strong and supportive relationships. It's very common, and I think I've seen it and had those own experiences over the years with teachers I've had. The ones that you really feel connected to are the ones that you really have positive learning with. If you don't like the person or you feel they don't like you, you hole up and you just kind of probably have a wasted year, unfortunately, in terms of what it looks. So, from an educator point of view, it's important to find ways to build those relationships and find ways to appreciate and support the work that's happening for all students. When we think about different children, not every children requires the same kind of relationship. Every child is unique, and certainly every child has their own strengths that we need to be honing in on. If we think about those learning or behavioral difficulties, it's often an expression of a relationship need. It's often not about what's right in front of you. And I think the one thing to think about is it's never too late to develop those stronger and more healthy relationships. They're ongoing. And if you have the opportunity to stay in a school over like past a year or two, you get to see those children growing up. And it's really, really rewarding when you see students that you've spent a number of years with and they're adults now and they still, feel very positive towards you and want to tell you all about their lives and all the great things that they've done up until that point. So when we think about what the school, so from a leadership space, we really do want to strive from a school to make sure that we're supporting students, knowing the children, knowing how their brain works, knowing each other, supporting each other, and really thinking it's not what you do, but it's why you do it. So we do know that this is, quite critical in terms of this development of relationships. And I'm thinking, from an Anishinaabe perspective, our relationality with each other is really a cornerstone of how we communicate and how we interact with each other. If we think about the safe and the sound school, these are, from 10 all the way down to number 1. These are some key pieces about things that we want to be thinking about how we develop a safe and sound school. At the very, very bottom, though, number 1 is the most important space. It's about attachment. So recognizing that attachment to each other, with each other, all the way up through self-regulation, understanding, physical activity, having those positive emotional experiences. All of these pieces really are the building blocks of a safe and sound school. So from here, we wanted to talk about just a few samples or examples, I suppose, of what dysregulation can look like. And you'll notice, although not always the case in this particular example, it's often boys, particularly in the early grades where school isn't necessarily or traditionally hasn't been set up for them. It's typically been set up for the child who sits, who follows rules, who's able to self-regulate. And, this is often not the case. So we really need to think about why aren't they engaged? What is the reason that they're not engaged in learning? So we agree that these kids don't just wake up in the morning and say, okay, I'm just going to do everything I can to be disruptive in class today. It's not a decision. It's not a logical decision that's in their brain, but they're unregulated. So when we think about dysregulated, it's unregulated to describe the state of mind that's preventing these students from engaging in active learning. So if we ask ourselves what triggers dysregulation, they could be anxiety, stress, worry, trouble at home, the inability to concentrate, being hungry, being tired. All of these things will impact how a student may be feeling. So if we want to think about some research, we do have some research of people like Barry Bruce, Stuart Shanker, and others who certainly have done a lot of work within the area of dysregulation. When we think about a regulated, this is what regulated can look like. We have kids that are engaged, we have kids that are smiling, we have kids that are achieving goals that they're setting up, we have kids that are working together as they're learning. So the question that I'd like you just to think about is what could we do? What have we done to help these students get to this place of self-regulation? So when we started looking at what behavior looked like, more specifically what misbehavior looked like and where it was coming from, we use the term regulated to describe being in a mood or condition that will lend itself to these students to being engaged in active learning. And that's really what we want to do, is set up this space so that all students can be operating from a regulated learning space. Just mindful of the time. So when we think about some of the applications in a typical classroom that we could or may have in your classroom, we want to think about relationships, certainly being really important, having that sense of well-being for all students and staff, being trauma informed, whether you're students or staff. Once you have the ability to understand how you're feeling, the way you're feeling, it really does, as Christy pointed out, really give that agency to our students. So if we're thinking about relationships, we can think about how we have strategies that build community. All children need to feel a sense of belonging, a sense of welcome, a sense of ownership on their learning space. One way that you can do that, and it's a way that I often start even though I work with adults, is having community circles. So opening your meeting or your time together or your day with a community circle where people can have an opportunity to go around the circle and speak to, things that are important. It might have a focus. It might be, fun sometimes. It might be in a response to a reading or a poem or an experience. But it really does allow that child to have a space to talk and a focus space for them to connect with all of the others in their classroom. And typically this is teacher facilitated, just to ensure that the process is equitable for everybody. If we think about the clear expectations with input, I used to have a little thing called call a friend. So if the students maybe were doing a circle and it was response to something and they were stuck, they could call a friend and then they'd point to someone else in the circle to give them a little hint, and then it would trigger something and then they would move forward. But developing those relationships on learning as well is a really important space. If we think about a whole school approach, all of these pieces in terms of what does it look like on the playground? When something happens, what does that restorative conversation look like between perhaps two kids and an adult in the moment, so that we can address small things and make sure kids are supported and relationships are preserved before they turn into something that's much bigger. So thinking, about all of these things are definitely ways that we can help move that forward. If we think about what a calm mindfulness looks like, what does a calm environment look like where we're appealing to all the senses? What does this classroom look like? So we're going to have a few photos here in a moment, so you can have a look at some examples of classrooms. So this is Jen Horty. She's a grade 4 teacher at Ogden. And this is There's No Place Like Home. And, at one point I was a principal there. And we had this is the NAN map, in case you our Chiefs of Ontario map, but you can see NAN territory predominantly in the north there. And what we had done is we'd mapped out the entire school to see where people were from on this map. And rather than privileging necessarily Thunder Bay or Fort Francis or Sault Ste. Marie, we were privileging First Nation communities, which have a prominence on this map. And then we put little arrows and faces and all kinds of things. So this is a couple of years later, and there was a young student, a male student, who came from one of the remote communities in NAN territory, and he was very withdrawn. So he was had become to that space it took him a few months to actually start to talking to people actually when he came. But he was talking with one of the facilitators who, worked with him a little bit every day. And at one point he started articulating, that he missed home. And he'd seen some pictures and it reminded me. And then they went on Google Map and they looked at the aerial views of the community. And it turned into, this was their classroom. So it's in the hallway right outside their classroom. And what they did, and this young person took the lead on, was they got this map. They started looking at all the other kids in the classroom, and then it just spurred a conversation over time that allowed people to think about those places that made them feel happy, safe, cared for, and the people in their lives. So all of these things became a really important part of developing relationships with this particular child and the other kids in his classroom and in his new community where he was now living in Thunder Bay. Some examples here of what this might look like in the classroom. So these are actual school examples. We want to be thinking about the physical environment, thinking about those pieces that are trauma informed, mindfulness, relationship, well-being, and having these spaces. And you'll notice perhaps that they're not super bright and bold colors. There's a lot of natural elements, pieces of wood, lighting that's not so bright and shocking to people's systems. A lot of opportunities for quiet, for reflection, for self-affirmation. So sorry about that, folks. We had a bit of a Zoom crash happening. So we'll just back up to where we were. So I know we have 7 minutes, so I'll wrap this up in about 2, and then we'll have a few moments for questions. So when we think about mindful, really what we want to be having people is a space where their mind is calm, it's open, they have space to learn in. If we look at the image on the left, it's full of all kinds of things, worry, I would call it noise, background noise, or noise that's taking over your whole brain. So we really need to understand perhaps what some of those pieces are. We've used deep breathing, and I'll show you a photo in a second. We've used calming practices, transitional chimes, really understanding how we use these practices and why we use these practices. And so that kids benefit from also knowing why we use these practices. It's amazing when you talk with young people and they've had a really good education on how their brain works. They really are able to navigate and negotiate their self-regulation much better. So if we think about our reflection, this doesn't happen overnight. We have to be realistic and make sure that these are appropriate for students. So the big question to ask yourself is, does your practice allow you to maintain positive relationships with students and other staff and community? So if we have a look here, this is just a little self-regulation table in the corner of a classroom. And there's food there in case people need food, because sometimes people are hungry, or my kids say the word hangry, they're hungry and it makes them cranky. And so they become hangry. But in there, there's several pieces to this self-regulation kit. There's some tactile pieces, some little bubble poppers. Take 5 deep breaths. You have to physically put those stickers on every time you breathe in and out, which then focuses your mind on the action of breathing. There's certainly that little clear plastic thing as those little bubbles. When you turn it upside down and the bubbles go up, and then you flip it back the other way and the bubbles go up. But all of these are tools to help students calm themselves and move into that zone of self-regulation. When we think about fostering our community, you really want to be thinking about shaping your school culture. Around resilience, understanding what being trauma and chronic stress sensitive, being reflective, and being organic. And really thinking about that, constructing a new narrative of hope, resilience, and sustainability. The place-based learning, ecological-based learning, land-based learning, all of these pieces are really, really important when we think about what this means to foster community in a strong way. And when we think about this child-centered community hub, these are just some of the examples that we had. Certainly within your community, there may be different ones, or there may be more. But we do know that the child is at the heart of it. The family and the school and the community are all, wrapping around, with love and with care for this particular child and each child. And then we have many different supports available in many communities, whether they're spiritual supports or a youth worker, some might be social services, different community partners, elders, healthcare, family supports as well. So really thinking about what that child-centered community hub looks like, and how you interact and enact that in your own school are really important ways to set up a space that is a trauma-informed school. So that is all I have to share. Christy had to leave, unfortunately. She had another presentation she had to head out to. But we have a couple minutes if there's any questions. Okay, live. Right.
Thank you very much. And
Okay.
some of the questions. So one of the questions says, any ideas for the childcare setting?
Right. So the pictures that we saw certainly, I think, could be used in both a childcare setting and a school. I know if you think about the lights, I've been in some childcares where they have little tiny candles that operate on a battery, and the kids actually sit down together at a table and have those batteries, and they have tactile time, working on things like Play-Doh. Even young children can learn how to engage in their own self-regulation in terms of breathing, in terms of calming. I know kids love to touch stuff. Depending on what was on my feet, sometimes I wear my moccasins into the childcare center, and they all want to touch the beadwork, and they all want to check it out, the fur. And so having those kind of things in a classroom, even just simple as a tanned rabbit. I used to keep a tanned beaver pelt in my classroom, and I taught JKSK for a number of years, and that kids will pet that. It's a calming kind of thing, in lieu of not having a live. We did have a rabbit too, but they didn't pet the rabbit so much. But those are some of those pieces there. I think recognizing little children too, singing, storytelling, become important. And music is a great way to bring people together, whether it's a beat on a drum or a shaker, but having people come together in that beat is really a way to bring people together and actually calm people down into that space. And I don't know if you probably have, but I often will notice young children around a drum. They just become mesmerized, and they start to get into that. It just hits them right in their heart, and they just get into that beat. And that's one way to self-regulate and just come into that space of calm. So that would be, a couple of examples, but I know there's a lot out there. I did want to share with you, I just printed it off, but it's a monograph that was written by Dr. Tranter and Dr. Kerr. They're both professors in the education department at Lakehead. And it's really understanding self-regulation and why stressed students struggle to learn. But they do have some really good examples in there as well. There's also a good book called Minds Up. It's activities and curriculum for children and youth. And some of those you may be able to move into the childcare area. The other question I see is, I wonder why the students who are the most disruptive are the ones who acknowledge you in public. I always called those kids my class. So they became the ones that I felt really needed the most support. And so, not that the others didn't, but we know that kids act up often because there's a reason, whether it's acting up or whether it's withdrawing completely, those two ends of that spectrum. They're often the students that require the most relational time with you as a caring adult, because you may be the one adult who talks to them in a day. They may be in other spaces where they're not having those kinds of relationships with them. And I was at Walmart not too long ago, and I ran into a young woman who was about 5'10" and much taller than me. And she turned around and she went, "Miss Baxter." And I said her name. I said, "Michelle," and I hadn't seen her in probably 8 years. But we had quite a journey when she was in elementary school together. And she came to a beautiful place by the end of it. But boy, to listen to her talk about her journey, and where she started and what she learned through these acts of working from a strength space and self-regulation, really did set her up, and she was doing really great, had a pretty good high school point, and she was now working. And, so that was really nice to see. But you're right. Those are the kids that years later, they remember you, and you certainly remember them. I think I'm at time right now. And we did have one question here, if I could just quickly address it. I understand that there's a need for being consistent and long-term approach needed to support, but is there anything you could suggest to offer as an alternative for students who have that weak in response to praise? And I would say at times praise is hollow to that. So we need to find ways to help kids be competent, because if you think about those 4 areas about being valued and trusted and competent and hopeful, those are the 4 pieces that every human being needs to have a strong identity. So rather than thinking about praise, think about competence, finding ways to help them demonstrate and learn something so that they're doing baby steps and they continue on. Because over time, those baby steps of success turn into the student feeling a sense of competence and accomplishment in their work. And then that's recognized. And we know strengths are only strengths if the person who has it recognizes it as a strength, and their community recognizes it also as a strength. So if they're not responding to praise, it's because probably they don't feel like it's a strength in them. So finding other ways and other areas that they can build their strengths in and actually feel like it's a strength as well. So just like to say miigwech, and thank you so much. I know we're late in the day, and really appreciate you joining us.
Miigwech, Denise. Any questions that were left over, whether in the chat or if they get forwarded later, we'll just make sure that Denise gets a chance to answer them, and then they'll be posted. So
thank you.
Yeah, just a reminder about the play to win code.
Community.
Remember to input that, and we'll be having a short break. And at 4 o'clock, we'll be moving on to the agenda for the recap, as well as the first prizes to be drawn. So enjoy your quick break, grab some water, and we will see you back at 4 o'clock. Thank you.